What I want to talk about in this video is what JavaScript actually is, not just at the language level, but also talk briefly about what the concept of the JavaScript ecosystem is. Because I know when you're just starting out as a beginner, there's a lot of stuff to learn when it comes to JavaScript, and sometimes it can get kind of muddied on the internet. You know, you hear all these different terms, like you might hear JavaScript, but then you might hear ECMAScript and Node.js and all of these things, and it can get kind of confusing. So what I want to do in this video is just kind of even out the territory for you and kind of explain, like, well, what do we mean by JavaScript? What is JavaScript as a whole, not just focusing on the language? So the first thing to know is that JavaScript is a programming language designed primarily for the creation of interactive web pages. That was its original intent. But more recently, it's been used for creating entire web applications. And we're going to get into how that came about. And really, the thing that's nice about JavaScript is that it's understood pretty much everywhere. So in this web browser right now, I've got my console open. So if you have trouble getting to this, if you right-click in your browser and you go down to Inspect here, you can pop up this bottom inspector window, and then you'll have a console tab here that you can click on. So in this console, I can type JavaScript code. So we'll just say hello here. And that code is immediately understood. And you'll notice that it doesn't need to be compiled. It doesn't need to be interpreted in any real way. It's just automatically understood by the web browser. And so what's nice, and you can see the code itself is pretty simple. I'm not having to do anything really that fancy here. So due to that simplicity and that ease of use and access, so it's just readily available, over the past 25 years, JavaScript has become one of the more popular choices. And so it's very common, and it's something that you're going to see quite a bit. And you're going to see in a lot of different contexts. So a quick history on JavaScript is that it was created in 1995 by a guy named Brendan Eich. And it was created in an effort to implement scripting languages in the browser. So when web browsers were first invented and when the internet was first starting to take shape, all developers really had access to was HTML. So the idea with JavaScript was, well, we want to make those web pages interactive. So if we click on a button, maybe it animates something, or if we fill out a form input, we can get the value of that input. But the idea was bring the concept of an actual programming language to a web browser, because before it was purely for displaying information. And so that's what they did at Netscape. So they hired Brendan to invent this brand new language, and there's kind of a rumor that floats around that JavaScript itself was designed in 10 days. That's partially true. So it was created as a prototype in 10 days, or one of the prototypes of JavaScript was created in 10 days, but the language itself has evolved pretty significantly over the last 25 or so years. It's developed quite a bit into a serious programming language, but that's a fun little fact. So if you're ever researching JavaScript and you're like, wait a minute, it was created in 10 days, it's like, technically, yes. Like the original foundations of the language were created pretty rapidly. And something else that's interesting to know is that the name is actually different than what it was when it was first released. So when Netscape originally released JavaScript as we know it, it was called LiveScript. So it was released in a beta before the actual final release of it. And at the time of that beta, it was called LiveScript. So it wasn't even called JavaScript. And while it's not really officially recognized at this point, basically the idea was that at the time, the Java programming language, so the server-side programming language created by Sun Microsystems, that had just come out as well, and it was gaining a lot of popularity. And so the rumor is that basically the folks at Netscape said, why don't we call it JavaScript as a marketing tactic to kind of like hitch on to the Java train and get some interest from that part of the world, which was, if that's true, that's pretty clever, and it does kind of make some sense. So that's basically how JavaScript was invented, or why it was invented. And then things started to get a little more serious. So in 1996, JavaScript was submitted to a standards board known as ECMA International. So this is just a group of people that basically take a piece of technology and they create a standard for it. So a standard is just an official set of rules that decide how a piece of technology should be implemented by vendors. And I kind of put that in air quotes. Vendors are basically, in this context, web browser makers, but a standard can be made for pretty much anything. It could be made for cars. So car manufacturers would have to implement their cars or build their cars based on a standard. So JavaScript itself has a standard called ECMAScript, and that's where things can get a little confusing. So if you're just getting started, you might be bumping into terms like ES6 or ES7 or ES 2015. And what those are referring to are different versions of the JavaScript standard. And I shouldn't say the JavaScript standard, it's really the ECMAScript standard. So the difference is that ECMAScript is the definition of how JavaScript or how that language should be implemented, but then JavaScript is an implementation of the ECMAScript standard. And so between about 1997, when the first version of the standard was released, so that would be officially ES1, and 2009, there were 5 official versions that came out. But then as JavaScript and interest in JavaScript started to develop, the release cycle started to grow a little bit. So you had version 6 come out in 2015, and now in 2019, we're up to version 10. So there's a lot of movement around JavaScript, and the language itself has evolved significantly over the past 10 or so years. It's really shifted from, something that was really just a basic language for working in the browser up to something that now, like we mentioned earlier, you can build entire web applications with. So it's really powerful. Now, there's some kind of gray area here. So like we're talking about with ECMAScript versus JavaScript, that can be a little bit confusing. But then there's a whole other side to this that I want to call out, and that is JavaScript the language versus JavaScript the ecosystem. So very often, a lot of the terms related or referencing JavaScript get kind of muddied together. And so what I want to do is kind of teach you or show you what is JavaScript the language versus what is stuff that exists in the JavaScript ecosystem. And so the first thing we're going to do is just look at this quick example here. So we've got some example JavaScript code, and this isn't functional code, this isn't doing anything, but it gives you kind of a preview of the syntax and the different parts of what JavaScript actually is. So here what I'm doing is I've got a variable. So there's different types of variables in JavaScript code, and as part of this feature fundamental series, we're going to go into all of these little details. So don't stress out if you're like, wait a minute, this is too much stuff. Don't worry about that. We're going to cover it. But for now, just kind of follow along and kind of absorb this stuff, because eventually you're gonna learn it in a hands-on way. But what I'm doing right here is I'm defining what's known as a constant type of variable called downloads to process. And then what I'm doing is I'm assigning that a value. So variables can assign or can be assigned values. And here I'm assigning it to an array of a different data type called an object. So arrays are a data type, as well as objects. So we're basically combining those two data types together. And so kind of like it looks, what we're doing is we're creating in JavaScript a list of things that we want to do something with. And in this case, what we're doing is we're saying, okay, these are downloads that we want to process. So we have each download that we want to process is being given an ID number, and it's being given a file name. And so what we want to do is be able to loop over each of those, and that's a phrase that you'll hear pretty often when you're working with JavaScript, is you're going to loop over something. So what we're doing here is we're going to loop over that list of downloads to process using this while loop. So a while loop is a way to say, do this while some condition is met. So in this case, we're saying while downloads completed, so this number right here is less than or equal to the length of this array. So in this case, we have 3. So we have 1, 2, 3 items in that array. Then we want to process the download. So to process a download, basically what we're doing is we're saying, okay, give us the download to process, and then we want to go ahead and save that file. So this doesn't really exist, this save as, so don't try to use that. This is purely for example, just to give you an idea of what does the syntax of JavaScript look like. So what we're going to say is, okay, for each iteration is another word that you'll hear. So for each iteration of this loop, or for each loop over these items. So when we say loop over, what we mean is we're going to start with this one, and then we're going to go to the next one. And the way that we go to the next one inside of this while loop is we're saying for each loop, what we want to do is get the file, save it, and then we're going to increment downloads completed here by 1. And so what this is doing is it's controlling this while statement. So we're saying while we're looping over this stuff, we're going to keep plussing 1 until +1 gets us to the point where we hit downloads.length. meaning, so we're going to start at 0 and we're going to iterate until we get to 3, and then we're going to stop. So that tells JavaScript, okay, stop doing this because that condition is no longer met, meaning downloads completed is no longer lesser than or equal to the length of our downloads to process array. And so what we're doing here is we're saying, well, we want to fire that or call that at a specific time. So we've wrapped all of that code with a function. And so a function, in this case, we're using the arrow function syntax. And there's multiple types of syntax for defining functions, but this one is the arrow syntax. And this is pretty common, so it shouldn't be too weird or shouldn't look too obscure to you. And so what we're doing is we're saying, okay, we have a function that takes in an argument. So whenever you see a value in between parentheses right before the arrow, those are known as arguments. So we're saying we're going to take in an argument of downloads, and then that's what we're going to use to process. So again, we've got downloads.length here controlling our while loop, and then we're pulling each of our downloads to process to actually save it to the computer. So we're passing those in to this function. So if you think about it, this is like the front door of a room, and we're passing downloads into that room where we might have a machine that's going to do that processing for us. And then at the very bottom, what we're doing is we're calling that function. So what's interesting is this code, even though it's defined here, isn't actually going to run until we call the process downloads function. Doesn't matter what we do. So in this case, what we're saying is call process downloads, and then we're going to pass in downloads to process. So downloads to process here is equal to this value up here, and then back down here. So when we say downloads to process here, because we're expecting downloads as an argument, downloads here matches this. So even though it may not look like it, downloads here is equal to this value. So we're basically passing in this array so that we can use it inside of our loop, which is pretty neat. So that's a basic example of JavaScript. Now, this is a little more complex, but the reason I wanted to show you that is so you could get kind of an idea of like, well, what does it look like to compose together some of the different parts in JavaScript? So that way you have a better idea of like, well, what am I getting myself into here? So that's part of it, and that's the language side of JavaScript. But on the ecosystem side, you're going to hear some different terminology or some different words or names that might confuse you a little bit. So the one I want to call out is Nodejs. So Nodejs is it's called a runtime for JavaScript. So basically what you need to know is that Nodejs is what we'll just call it a tool to allow you to run JavaScript outside of web browsers. So like we saw earlier, I've got console log hello down here. This was immediately understood by the web browser because JavaScript is implemented inside of web browsers. But outside of web browsers, JavaScript isn't understood without a tool like Node.js. So up until 2009, JavaScript only existed in web browsers. You couldn't use it anywhere else. So what's difficult about that is if you're trying to build, we'll say, a web application, so something like Facebook, in the past, so before 2009, you would have had to write your code in 2 different languages, or you would have had to know 2 different languages, which is difficult. So you would have had to write JavaScript in your web browser for making your web page interactive, but then for actually making the application work on the back end or on the server side, you would have had to learn a different language. Like you might have had to learn PHP or Ruby or something like that. And so what Ryan Dahl set out to solve in 2009 was like, well, JavaScript's a pretty nice language. It's very simple and it's easy to use. Why can't we use that elsewhere? Why can't we use that wherever we want to program things? And so Node.js was the solution to that. And I call that out because it's likely that as you're learning things, you might come across Node.js, and that can be kind of confusing because it at times can be portrayed as like, oh, this is a part of JavaScript, but it's not. So over here, I've got nodejs.org opened up in my browser, and you can see Node.js is something that you have to download. So this is a totally separate thing that you're going to install on your computer, and then you'll be able to run that JavaScript code elsewhere. So until you do that, you won't be able to do it. Now, Node.js is pretty advanced, so I would say up until the time that you've actually had an opportunity to get your hands dirty with JavaScript, kind of leave that aside until you understand the fundamentals. So if stuff like this is starting to make sense to you, that's when you can start to get your hands dirty with something like Node.js without it being totally overwhelming. So that's part of the ecosystem. And then another part that you might hear about is NPM packages. And so, kind of like the name hints at here, NPM stands for Node Package Manager. So NPM was invented by another guy, Isaac, I think it's pronounced Schluter. So Isaac basically right around the same time that Node.js was released realized that like, well, this is going to need a package system if it's going to be really valuable. And so that was invented as a way for developers to share their JavaScript or their Node.js code with each other. So NPM it has a lot of different names, and again, this can be kind of confusing, so don't let it trip you up too much. But basically, what NPM is doing is it's hosting packages, and packages are basically chunks of code that other developers have made publicly available. So a really popular package is React. So you might hear about React as you start to develop. So what I just did here is on npmjs.com, I searched for a package name, and I can see here I found React. So what you're going to see is basically just instructions on how to use a package once you click into one. So a package, again, it's just code that makes it easy for you to get some functionality without having to write it from scratch. So basically, NPM is the host of all of that code, and what they have you do is install a tool in your command line. So your command line is basically where you can talk directly to your computer and write commands. So it makes you look like a hacker. And so what you're doing in there is you're going to say things like npm install and then some package name. And so what that does is it says, bring that code from npm into my project. And then what that does is it allows you to get that functionality that that package implements inside of your own project. So for example, if you had to upload files to a server, writing that code from scratch can be kind of time consuming. And so you can download a package that essentially allows you to upload files to your own server very easily. So usually a package will implement a function or something like that. So you might say upload files, and then all you'll have to do is pass in a file name. So we'll just say myfile.js, and then you'll have some content for that file. But the idea is that what packages do is they streamline your ability to work with JavaScript so that you're not having to write everything or invent everything from scratch. So that's kind of the ecosystem or the parts that I think are worth explaining to you. So Node.js and NPM packages, those you're probably going to hear quite a bit about. But that's about it. We don't want to go too far here because, again, this is just like a general overview of what is JavaScript. But what I want to do to finish up is I want to walk you through a quick example of using JavaScript in your web browser. So here you can see we've got some example code, but I've actually got this set up on my own computer. So when you're talking about JavaScript, again, we're in the web browser here, and then here I'm in what's known as a text editor, or you'll hear this referred to as an IDE, an interactive development environment. And so the specific IDE that I'm using is one called VS Code, and this is completely free. You can download this. This is created by Microsoft and maintained by Microsoft, but it's completely free, and you can download it to your own computer so that you can edit and work on your code. So inside of my text editor, or VS Code, what I've got open is two files. So I've got index.html and I've got example.js. So this should be pretty obvious, but if it's not, this is JavaScript code and this is HTML code. And so what we're saying here is, okay, we want to set up an HTML page, and we're going to give it a title of interactive JavaScript example. And then in the body of the page, so just to make sure this is clear, we're going to look at this. So over here in the browser, I have an input and a button being drawn on the screen. So what we're doing back in our code to achieve that is we've written an input tag in HTML, and we've written a button tag in HTML. So we can see here this input and this button's a little more obvious, so it says say hello. We've got say hello here along with our input right next to it. So we've got those two things, but then you'll notice that I'm using this thing called a script tag. So a script tag is what we use to load JavaScript into an HTML page. So without this, our JavaScript isn't going to execute. It's not going to know what to do because it's not loaded in the browser. So what we're going to do is use this script tag, and then we're going to set its src or source property equal to the path to our JS file. Now in this example, I've kept things pretty simple. I've just got an example JS file right here in the same folder. So on your computer, you could put two files. You would create a file called index.html in a folder, and then right next to it in the same folder, you would create example.js. So example.html is pretty simple. And again, it's just saying we're going to draw an input on screen and a button, and then we're going to import this example.js file. And if we look at that, again, I've made this a little more involved, but I wanted to show you something really cool and interactive. Like when we talk about JavaScript, we're saying this web page should be interactive. So I wanted to show you something really neat. So don't worry if this doesn't make sense. I'm going to walk you through it, and then we're going to kind of see how it works in the browser, so you get a feel for like how is this code executed and what does it do. So up here, what I'm saying is we want to listen for an event called DOM content loaded. So when things happen in a web browser, those are known as events. And as developers or JavaScript developers, we can listen for different types of events. So what I'm saying here is I need to know when the web page has loaded. And the reason I need to know that is that I can't find our button or our name input. So again, these two pieces of code right here. So we have our input and our button. I won't be able to, and I'm going to say this in quotes, I can't see those until JavaScript, or excuse me, until the browser has actually loaded that content on the page. So literally the DOM content has loaded. And DOM is another term that you're going to hear. That stands for Document Object Model, which is a really nerdy way of saying what the browser has drawn on screen. So don't let that confuse you too much. So what we're saying here is, okay, when the DOM content has loaded, meaning all of the content here has loaded up, what we want to do is we want to find the button on the page. So we're going to use this document.querySelector method. So this is a method in JavaScript. And a method is usually represented by, you'll see a dot. So document is what's known as an object inside of JavaScript. Now we don't see this. This is something that you'll learn as you go why this is. But we have an object somewhere, and we have querySelector, which is a function defined on an object. So whenever you see a function defined on an object, that's going to be, its name changes. It gets turned into a method. And that's just a way to kind of explain what this thing is. So it's still a function, but the name gets changed so that you can kind of differentiate between. So the way that you can tell if something is a method or not is you can see here I'm referencing this document object, and then there's a dot, and then the name of the function that I'm trying to call. So I'm saying document dot and then some method name. So in this case, querySelector. So what we're saying is go ahead and select the element on the page that's a button element. So again, back here, we're saying we want to get this element from the page so that we can do something with it. And what we're doing is we're listening for another event. But this time, notice that instead of listening on the document, meaning the entire web page, what we're doing is we're listening for an event on this button element that we just found in the document. So what we're saying is when that button is clicked, we want to run some code. So here we've got another function. So just like up here, we're saying when DOM content is loaded, call this function. And now we're saying when the button is clicked, fire this function. And so inside of that function, what we're doing is we're saying, first find the input. So find the input tag right here where the user is going to type their name in. And then we're going to say, okay, now that we have that, let's get the value of that input. So when the button is clicked, we're going to make the assumption that the user has typed something into that input. And in order to get what they've typed in, we need to reference the value property of the name input. So this code right here is going to return an object with a bunch of different stuff on it. It's going to say the name of the input. It's going to have the value of the input and all kinds of stuff. And actually, just so you can get an understanding for that, let's take this and I'm going to jump over the browser here and I'm going to open a console up. So we're going to open the console, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to say input equals, and we're going to do that. And then if I say input, you can see how it lights up and it draws it there, but I can also do something called console.dir. And if I pass input in, we can see that in input has a bunch of different stuff on it. So it's got all this stuff. So right now, if we scroll down here and we look for the value property, we're going to try and find it. Where is it? So right now it's empty. So if I type my name in, so we'll say Ryan, we're going to clear this out. And then we're going to say that again. So I cleared my console so there wasn't a bunch of stuff in the way, but that still exists in memory. So that's why that still worked. So now if we open that back up and go to the bottom, we see that the value has been set to Ryan because I've actually typed something into that input. So back here in the code, what we're doing is we're saying, okay, get that value from the input, and then we're using what's known as a JavaScript alert message. So an alert message is a way to pop up something on the screen to say like, hey, you need to know about this, or hey, check this out. And so that's typically used for throwing errors, but for demonstration, we can also use it just to kind of greet us warmly. We say like, hello, and then whatever name we've typed in. So what this code is doing here is it's saying we want to take a string, call with the text hello inside of it and a space, and then we're using a plus to concatenate with that string our name value. So right here we've got name as whatever the user has typed into the input. So we're going to say hello plus that name variable, and then we're going to append another string on the end, which is just an exclamation point. So when all is said and done, we should get back a single string that says hello and then whatever name we typed in followed by an exclamation point. This is what we expect. Now, because we're passing that string or that concatenated string to the alert message, what we'd expect to happen on screen is that text to pop up. So if we go ahead and save this, we're going to come back over here and refresh, and I'm going to type in my name, and then we're going to click, and we can see I clicked on the button, so clicked here, and then we alerted with the text, hello Ryan. So we alerted here this text, and we had that text because we were able to get it from the input and grab the input's value. So just one more time, and I don't know, maybe your name is Steve. That would be really convenient. We'll say, hello, Steve, or we'll just keep it really generic. We'll say, hello, person, and we get hello, person. So pretty neat. And that's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to JavaScript. JavaScript is a crazy powerful language. And if you can imagine, like we were able to do what we just did in a browser with just a few lines of code, you can achieve even greater things using tools like Nodejs that we just talked about and JavaScript itself in the browser. And there's so much to learn and so much stuff to get into. So if you're new to JavaScript and you're just starting to learn it, I'm really excited for you because it's crazy powerful and it's something that you can create some really cool stuff with. So if you want to keep going here, what you need to do is check out a few different tutorials. So I really like this Learn JavaScript on Learn.js tutorial. So this is going to walk you through the basics of JavaScript, all the different parts. So we just looked at a kind of an overview of this, but this is going to give you a look at all the different parts that are available to you. And then you've got Learn JavaScript on Codecademy. So Codecademy is a little more interactive. They give you an interactive kind of shell that you can type into and it'll respond back to you, which is kind of fun. And then the last one I would recommend is checking out the JavaScript courses over on Treehouse. So they've got a bunch of different stuff. They've got a course on basics, they've got a course on loops, arrays, and objects, and all kinds of other stuff that you can get into. So definitely recommend checking those out. So that's going to do it for this episode of Feature Fundamentals. Hopefully that gave you a better overview of what JavaScript actually is. And good luck on your journey. I think you're really going to enjoy working with JavaScript, and I hope you have some fun with it.